So this is going to be a lightning fast intro. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome back my dear friend Vlad Vexler, someone who not only has provided, I think, a lot of support to the community, but a lot of necessary insight in these terrible times. And he's done it, given many of you know extraordinary health conditions, and yet still is able to bring his insight and perspicacity to the audience, which we value. We're going to make a short episode today, and I'll stop rambling. Vlad, welcome back. It's been, I think, probably a year since we last caught up.
It's lovely to be back, John. Thanks for having me.
It's a huge pleasure. And of course, a lot of stuff has happened since then, which is slightly less pleasurable, less lovely, as you say in your videos. Um, we have Trump, but we also have this extraordinary flip-flop between the sort of will he, won't he, almost like a sort of gay media theatre, which I suspect is part of the point. But it has been a bit of a roller coaster.
It's been a roller coaster, and I think we're struggling to process it because there's something very big happening, at least very big by our historical standards, by the standards of our experience in recent decades. We're moving from one moment of historical possibilities to another. And because our recent history in the West has been relatively stable, we're freaking out about this and we're really struggling to process it. I think if you pushed me hard and said, Vlad, how big is this by the standards of historical transformation humans go through? I would say it's small to medium. But to us, it looks like extra large simply because of the relatively contingent period of, to a certain degree, post-World War II, and then even more so post-1989 stability that we have enjoyed. So one of the biggest things I really struggle with and I really try to work on is just the depth of incomprehension and unintelligibility with which what's happening strikes us. I think you feel this in your community. I feel this very much in my community, that the biggest concern isn't so much that things are going badly, but um, is the world even making sense anymore? And how do we live through that in a constructive and hopeful way? So it's really huge stuff for us. By the broadest historical standard, it's small to medium, but that's more than big enough to freak the living daylights out of us.
But I also think there's characteristics which perhaps we would find it difficult to place exactly as a kind of template in other periods of history. And that phrase, I think, is a fascinating one that it's difficult to make sense of. What sort of shocks me about the space that we're in is that it's no longer deemed important to make sense. It's no longer deemed important to anchor your beliefs in some kind of evidence, some kind of evidential framework or system of values. Now it seems to be completely detached. You can have systematic lies, ones even that flip-flop wildly from one day or one week to the next. And this isn't just Trump. This seems this detachment from evidence-based or experience-based politics is, I think, the most worrying thing. And it's not that you wouldn't have had politicians that sort of lied and make stuff up in the past. Of course, you would, but you would have had a threshold of people who fundamentally have an agreement to live in reality-based politics. We seem to be moving beyond that space. That seems most disturbing.
A lot of our politics takes advantage of our desire not to be duped, but actually ends up pushing us into a predicament where we mistrust everything. And it's very paradoxical how people who don't want to be fooled end up not believing anything at all, and thereby actually guaranteeing that they will remain in the predicament of being, in a sense, permanently fooled because they have no resources whatever to make sense of what's up and what's down and what's left and what's right. This is very difficult. you tackle it with responsible politics, but responsible politics in a post-truth age will often be drowned out because, of course, truth, as professional philosophers know, does not have its own police. If we find an academic sitting in his or her office, let's say in an authoritarian regime, saying things that are true and being absolutely right, that does not reduce the chances they're going to be taken away in the middle of the night. If anything, actually, that increases the chances they're going to be taken away in the middle of the night. So we're facing the reality that it's only under very privileged historical conditions that truth actually has social power. So we're experiencing a kind of situation where it's difficult to get purchase, it's difficult to get friction with truthful claims. We're truly entering a kind of post-truth age in which it's not true that all hope is lost, but which it's going to take us enormous skill to mitigate and to negotiate over the decades to come.
And there's elements of this that are familiar, aren't there? The idea of nihilism, the idea of not believing or not believing there is objective truth. This is quite familiar from the world of Russian propaganda, and dare I even say it, a sort of a deep-seated strand of nihilism that cuts through Russian history and literature. It wasn't always dominant. It didn't always reach a threshold, but there is a certain nihilistic trend there, which then is weaponized in certain propagandistic media. It also seems this is combined with a sort of curious effect. Now, I don't know, I don't know. People will say, education plays a big role, and of course it does. But how big is the role that the previous generations of politicians would have grown up in the shadow of the Second World War, would have grown up understanding the importance of the institutions that were being built and nascent, or maybe just a few decades old, and understanding why it's important to have common narratives on certain things. You still have very diverse politics, but we grew up in an era where it was called consensus politics. And yes, there was a certain viciousness, of course there was, in the cut and thrust of politics, but actually when you examine it, the tone, the language, and actually many of the common values were far closer together now than we see in the disparate strands, even of not just right wing, but sort of at the extreme left and right.
So that's the part of our equation that's all about a lack of historical memory, a lack of a commitment to truthfulness that has to be practically embodied and practically embodied in institutions, and an extraordinary lack of responsibility too. We are getting spectacularly irresponsible post-truth ex-conservative authoritarian buffoons doing very, very well at the ballot box. However, I think all of that is probably secondary to social forces that are undermining our capacity to cohere as a political community, whichever Western country you might be talking about. We've got technological transformation. We're in the age of social media that is essentially putting us in completely unregulated public squares where it's impossible to engage constructively. And as a result, we end up occupying not just distinct mental worlds, but distinct fact worlds. We've got profound economic exclusion still all over the West, and a kind of hopelessness about one's economic prospects for the future that makes people give up on politics. We have got all kinds of ideologies of self-realization that don't just emphasize the individual, but run collective projects all about social justice and all about um, elevating disadvantaged groups, still through a hyper individualized politics of authenticity and self realization, which makes it difficult to talk about the public good, to talk about solidarity, what we all here, let's say in this country, in Britain, share together. We have got a range of social forces, therefore, that are making it very difficult to escape a crisis of trust, escape a situation where citizens feel not just powerless and betrayed by politics, but actually feel that politics is what we mentioned a moment ago, no longer transparent, no longer intelligible. And if that's the case, you might as well throw something at it and break it up, see what comes next. So there are enormous destructive impulses swimming about, not just in the elected officials, but in their voters. But that's not just because of intellectual failure or moral failure. It's actually primarily because of a set of social forces, none of which we control, creating conditions that are very, very hard to reconcile with maintaining the sort of trust, maintaining the sort of possibility for all of us participating in a joint sense of fairness in society. Maintaining all of that has become really, really difficult. And therefore, you can't intellectually or morally sort of lift people out of that. You have to begin fighting it by actually looking at the social forces that are driving it and trying to tackle those, which means uh, electoral reform. It means various kinds of institutional reform and supplementation. It means taking on the reality that unaccountable potato chip companies effectively control our public squares. It means powerfully and patriotically speaking to all citizens of a country as though they were in it together and getting rid of some of the divisive language of the past, which made us think that nobody can really understand one another unless they belong to the same group. So it's going to need a lot of politics, and it's going to need a lot of policy, and it's going to need a lot of reform in the first instance to begin mitigating this crisis. In the second instance, of course, we need moral impetus. And of course, we need a call back to a serious commitment to getting the world right. But in of themselves, these kinds of intellectual or moral rallying cries are going to be a kind of running on the spot, so long as the underlying issues still persist.
Of course, it may be that our institutions wouldn't have shown their brittleness and feebleness uh, at this point in time. I think it's sort of inevitable that a crisis would have tested their brittleness. But it also happens that the period we're going through is coincidental with, I would say, the end of regime, possibly even end of empire or slow motion car crash that is Russia. It's the last and maybe the largest land-based empire, the last great European empire, a multinational entity that is almost too absurd to exist. It certainly doesn't exist to benefit the majority of its population, and it coincides with Putin, who is reaching a period where he seems to have had to reach for much more repressive tools, war as a tool to shore up his regime. It's coincidental that an aggressive, expansionist, unstable, I would almost say, Russia coincides with extreme brittleness of our institutions. It's like a perfect storm almost.
Some of the features of post-truth politics that we talked about are best expressed in Russian propaganda, of course, which puts an emphasis on convincing you that inaction is the best political position and convincing you that there is no such thing as truth. And if you're seriously suspicious of power, you'd better be suspicious of everything so corrosively that you doubt the difference between truth and facts themselves. And the techniques of Russian propaganda center on denying in general the difference between truth and lies. They center on letting go of consistency of claims. It's raining and it's not raining at the same time. They center on saturating our informational environment with an overwhelming volume of incompatible claims. And they do all of this not with a view to persuading us into a particular picture of the world, but into simply depoliticizing us, sort of disabling us as effective political operators, because what this propaganda starts with is that which we already feel and think. It doesn't try to persuade us of a new vision of the world. It starts with our psychology and then asks, how can we manipulate it to bring it about that we become rendered ineffective as citizens and rendered ineffective as sense makers of the political reality around us. Having said all of this, it's very important to not just draw a straight line and say, when we encounter post-truth politics in the West, that it is an export from Russia. Because here two questions arise. How far is the global spread of this informational environment a matter of contagion, or how far is it a matter of convergence? That we're all converging on something unlovely, not because we've caught the disease from Russia, but because it's just a global disease of which Russia happens to be the most extreme patient. And here you've got to do a very difficult exercise in our informational environment, which is keep two things at the same time. One is that the Russians are objectively interfering in our democracies, and that is, in fact, a purpose of the Putin regime that's been there for over a decade, at least since the 2014 annexation of Crimea. At the same time, we've got to not exaggerate the impact of Russian interference in our democracies while acknowledging that it's real. Because if we do that, it'll blind us to the domestic causes of what is going wrong and to the social forces that we here at home need to address. And so one of the disturbing conclusions we've got to face is that in many ways, post-truth politicians in the West, like, for instance, Mr. Farage, may be sounding kind of Russian in ways that look suspicious to us, but actually not for reasons of being controlled or even influenced by Russia, but for reasons of a global wash of various kinds of social forces pushing all of our politics in a certain very unlovely and very dangerous direction that's frankly not compatible with the sustenance of democracy. So making sense of this really requires us to be skilled at keeping two hats on at the same time and not externalizing all of the problems we've got to malign Russian interference while admitting that malign Russian interference is real.
And there's another conjunction in this perfect storm, which of course is not just the rise of social media, because I don't think it was inevitable that social media platforms would gravitate towards, I would say, an extreme clickbait in the best case scenario, in the worst case scenario, actual, leaning on the scales of algorithms towards one political point of view, or dare I say it, as it's been termed, a sort of techno-fascist point of view. What we're talking about is a sort of extreme oligarchic capitalism combined with these very powerful platforms, which is skewering the public space. And the algorithms, I think, are having a very detrimental effect on public discourse and how we perceive, our fellow citizens and engage in that dialogue with them. I don't think it was inevitable that the algorithms are going that direction. I think maybe it's a factor of several things, but especially the ownership, private ownership of those. Not to sound like an out-and-out communist there, but it is combined with all these things come together. And one thing that sort of concerns me as well, I come from a weekend of having sort of debates with relatives whom I love dearly. But it just struck me that it was very difficult to have a conversation about certain things, including the war, which wasn't difficult 2 years ago because it seemed completely morally black and white. Absolutely. I didn't have any relativist conversations. But just the last couple of weeks and, speaking to sort of close relatives, there's an extraordinary, I would say, incoherent relativism that comes in. They'll cite a particular historic fact, And they say, and that therefore means that what's going on now is not black and white. It's not morally simple. Things are sort of smeared with grey. That is another classic Russian technique. I'm not saying they got it from there or they're influenced by a Russian technique, but the risk of falling into a kind of incoherent relativism and very shallow historicism that makes politics very difficult too.
I think we have a crisis of incomprehension. I think we have a crisis of incapacity to read and listen to the point that reading properly is becoming a radical act currently in the West. And two issues arise. If somebody in your life has fallen into post-truth or an excessively conspiratorial outlook, or has really lost their rudder epistemically, one thing you want, of course, is to try to engage with them and to try to persuade them. And I always say that the best way of doing that is to establish intimacy and to spend 90% of the time talking about not the political issue in which you have a challenge with them. But then something else arises, and that is you've got to keep your own sanity too. Because I know from my own community, which, let's be frank, is particular, probably centrist-leaning left with a few constitutional conservatives there who we love, overwhelmingly pro what I call the sustenance of democratic institutions, pro-Ukraine. So we're looking at a very special demographic, not a very small demographic. It represents large, at least minorities of the citizens of Western countries. But in my community, I also sense a crisis of comprehension. I also sense a crisis of having a difficulty of keeping two things in mind. I also sense a crisis of wanting easy answers to very scary and complex questions. Like, yes, it is all about the Russian interference. My country would be sort of impeccable if we didn't have that. Or my country would be impeccable if Donald Trump had never been born, who decided to play golf instead of going into politics. And on the one hand, people lead busy and stressed lives and know they don't need to become expert practitioners of the craft of politics. They don't need to read political philosophy. But at the same time, a lot of what will happen in the next 10 years in the West will depend on the efficacy of citizens, will depend on how, A, they can keep their head straight and not lose it, how they're able to remain constructively engaged with politics, which doesn't just mean voting. It means talking to people in your life. It means engaging in the local community. It means being open to any forms of participation, especially at a local level. It means being informed by the news, but not overwhelmed by it. So actually, a lot depends not on an individual doing this, but a lot depends on tens of millions of people in our societies doing this rather than going to sleep politically, because it's all so overwhelming. It's all so scary. It's all so unintelligible. And one of the problems we've got is that we don't have a very strongly developed muscle for dealing with darker times, for being in constructive grief about darker times coming. And that invites us to really give up or focus on sort of easy answers of a self-congratulatory sort to complex questions. So one of the things that I am emphasizing infinitesimally in my tiny, tiny work online is process. Not just what is it important for citizens to think, but how do they think? How do they feel? How do they react in their own way, not in the way that I propose? But what I do propose, however, certain structures, certain procedural modes, which are all about keeping people's sanity and keeping people not too close, but also not too detached from the political reality around them. And you might think, well, no, that seems passive. It's just, you're talking about people just sitting around the din and being informed about politics. No, I actually think that if folks who have a track record of voting for responsible pro-democratic politicians in the past all don't lose their mind, that will do a lot to stop the rise of authoritarianism in the West in of itself. Um, it will at least reduce the rate of democratic collapse in the West by 2040 from, let's say, 40% to 20%, which will be a huge benefit and utterly transformational for the lives of millions of people. So it's important to keep, if you like, our pro-democratic side sane and engaged, and to keep them sort of on this running track where they develop their muscle for dealing with a bit of historical darkness. Because at the moment, that muscle is not properly built up. And I sense that a lot of people are about 5, 10 years away from even accepting what's happening.
Yeah.
Because the tendency is to say, well, I'm so sorry, but it's a few bad actors like Trump or Farage. We take them away, we're going to be fine. But actually, something big historically is happening that is spitting out these people into our political life. And so
Yeah.
it's time to process this, but that's gonna take time too.
I think that's the fundamental misunderstanding, isn't it? It's not that these characters are uniquely bad at this point, and uniquely dangerous. It's just that in other circumstances, they wouldn't be granted power. Their narratives wouldn't cut through necessarily. Um, and these people have always been around, from Oswald Mosley through to, we can name numerous other figures. And in fact, I think it's the stories we tell ourselves. If we tell ourselves stories of strength and resilience, and we find those common narratives with people who we may have very disparate, let's say, personalities or views, but if we find those narratives we have in common and tell ourselves stories of strength, I think that's important. Whereas a lot of the stories we're telling ourselves are of division and despair. And that, of course, is put on steroids by algorithms that actually find that's a lot better way to engage people and make money by telling those kind of stories or putting those to the fore.
And the level of education we have about how to negotiate the internet is, I think, also insufficient because it's actually quite a complex thing. I mean, I and you have a sort of professional relationship with the world of online platforms, in particular this one. And even for us, it's not straightforward how to negotiate this. So it's almost a matter of civic education to bring it about that we have citizens who can negotiate this world effectively. Because most people feel either lost by it or are pushed into a kind of psychology of moral disgust. Well, this is so bad that I'm going to detach myself. So we need quite a big improvement in our epistemic skills around negotiating essentially the public squares of our societies, which most citizens A don't have and B don't know where to get. And it's something that I'm thinking about too, but I can only make a difference on a very, very small scale. But we've got to wake up to that because it's a mistake to think that simply in virtue of being smart or um, you know wise about other matters in life that one's going to be good at negotiating this environment. It actually takes a degree of skill. And at the moment, we are being outgunned. We have less skill than the mess and complexity of the environment we're in demands.
Mm, absolutely. I mean, I tend to think that things like history, philosophy, and culture to an extent are some of the ways out of this problem. I'm going to fire a question at you, and it's a little bit of a glib question here. Um, we have loosely termed this thing called Trumpism, and we have a thing called Putinism, and they are relatively incoherent as ideologies. One might not even call them ideologies. They're a loose collection of tropes and myths and methodologies and ways of. I'd almost describe them as business models, as it were, or informational business models, which is going to outlive the person that helped to bring these into existence. Is Putinism going to outlive Putin? Is Trumpism going to outlive Trump?
Putinism and Trumpism are both part of a kind of global ideological wash that will outlive both of them. There's one element of Putinism that is fairly distinct, and it's not part of that wash, and Trump will never share it, and Trump's successors will never share it. And that's a kind of mysticism, which I attribute to the Russian regime, a kind of nihilistic and apocalyptic way of approaching the world, which we shouldn't overstate. It's not that these people want to blow themselves up, but they have a different relationship with even something like the value of life than we do or than Soviet leaders did. So there is a special mystical element to the Putin regime, which floats all kinds of ideas about um, propelling Russia from the back row to the front row of nations. Ideas like a certain kind of you know, titillation in the prospect of self-immolation and so on. So there is that mystical element to the Putin regime, which I think some commentators dismiss mistakenly. But if we put it aside, we're left with several elements, which I think Trumpism and Putinism share in common. One is a kind of monarchism, which cartoonishly is simply the notion that there's no good reason for why anything should stand in the path of the authority of a single ruler. This is the notion that the only source of political legitimacy is the person at the top making decisions. And when things get in their way, that's just not effective or not serious or based on certain democratic ideals that are washed out or were never real to begin with. Putinism and Trumpism are examples, Putin a more extreme example of this monarchist ideology that's doing the rounds globally, that I think is triggered not just by mistakes or bad thinking or moral failure, but by social forces that are making the sustenance of democratic life hard. Another element to this ideology isn't monarchism, but a kind of idea of might is right, a kind of idea that it's not just the strongest who wins, but it's the strongest who should win. Now, I call this hyper neoliberalism for two reasons, because I think that there's a structured way in which neoliberalism, kind of putting magical primacy on the market, risks sliding under deleterious historical conditions into just a normalization of unbounded competition of all against all. That's one reason I use that term. The second reason is that I think that that process in a particular way materialized in Russia. In other words, I think there's a historical continuity between the calamitous anarcho-capitalism of the 90s and the might is right politics of Putinism. That might is right is a politics that Trump, constrained by institutions, of course, shares. That's exactly what's manifested when he talks about annexing Canada or annexing parts of European countries and so on. And then I suppose the other element that's part of this ideology is unfortunately fascism. I'm not saying that the ideology is itself fascist, but it has many fascist connotations. One of them, of course, essential one, being the notion that you have got to smash up what we have in order to return to a golden past that never was. And there are plenty of features of fascism, which I went through on my main channel a few weeks ago, which I think are expressed both in Trumpism and in Putinism. So the way I'd put this is that this is a wave that's coming over us, but the party that's got the most soaked, the party that's expressed this ideology most extremely is Russia. And what's freaky about Russia is more its extremity than its uniqueness in expressing this unlovely ideology, which unfortunately, I would argue, post-truth authoritarian politicians in Europe share too, from the AfD to Nigel Farage in the UK. And so we've got to be realistic about the fact that this is coming our way, and we need sober, non-historically naive defenses against it. So that's what I see is happening, which is to say that Putinism will collapse. It's a self-immolating project. It'll collapse. I also think Trumpism will collapse. However, the ideological wash that I'm mentioning won't collapse and will generate replacements. In the United States, that's more likely to be a responsible and, well, a responsible in a non-ethical sense of disciplined and strategic authoritarian who is more systematic than Trump.
More effective. That's actually scary.
That's the better word. That's what's likely to come after the self-immolation of Trumpism. You could say, might that not be the continuation of Trumpism? That's a plausible case, but I'd argue that there'll be several unique features to Trumpism that'll just be washed out by history. So it won't make sense to call the next thing Trumpism 2.0. It'll be some version of intimidating, divisive, exclusionary, anti-institutional authoritarianism. So that's what's going to happen. These particular projects are going to implode, but we've got to be careful to not fantasize ourselves into the delusion that once they implode, democracy will renormalize. It won't. It'll be even harder than it is today to stand up for democratic values and democratic institutions. Having said all this, we're still going to have a chance, even then, when it's going to be harder to keep our democracies.
That's right. And I think people have asked me, many people who know there's a war in Ukraine and followed it perhaps quite intently when it started, but have now detached for various reasons. They ask me these questions like, well, when's it going to be over? They don't, what's going to happen afterwards. I think there's almost an implicit assumption that things will return to how they were. I think almost everyone is sort of just unconsciously on autopilot thinking that's going to happen. Even some high ranked sort of military people sort of in a much more considered way say, well, what's going to happen? What's going to happen when Russia loses or there's a ceasefire or whatever? And I say, well, this is not a process for returning to normalcy. It seems to me that Russia as an entity is just too large to function for the benefit of its people. And it has a demographic crisis, and its model of existence does not fit with the modern world, with the idea of creating wealth and innovation, the trust cooperation that's required to run businesses. Even if that is absent from our politics, there's still a high quota of trust and cooperation to make our complex economies work. Russia just does not, unfortunately, work in that way. My belief is that it's on a process of, it might be like a kind of pendulum swinging backwards and forwards, but with each swing now, it seems to me it's destructive and leading towards some kind of end to Russia as an imperial entity. But as we know with, the Turkish Empire or Ottoman Empire, people still exist on that territory. Cities still exist, and elements of the culture still remain. So it is possible to imagine a post-imperial Russian entity. But I don't think people are in the space to think about these big historical processes or how to deal with them. Some may be deluded to think we can control either one way or the other, which of course we can't. But as you say earlier, I think we've lost that ability to really put things in a historical context. But we are in a historical age, and we are seeing some big tectonic movements taking place over the coming months, years, decades.
I think that it's important to, first of all, understand where our own societies and democracies are moving. We're still struggling with that. And unfortunately, they are moving in an authoritarian direction. When it comes to thinking about Russia, I think that the best thing to say is that historically Russia is going to have to reckon with what holds the country together. The arguments standardly made for the disintegration of Russia, and I made a big video about this about a year or two ago on the main channel, are to me, not persuasive and often rely on false claims about the balance of various ethnicities in different parts of the country.
No, I entirely
How,
agree with you. That was a
however,
great video. My direct experience tells me that they don't exist as nation
however,
states. Yeah, yeah.
however, Russia cannot decolonize in the constructive sense of that term, not in the hyperactivist sense of that term, um, without a conversation with itself that changes the relationship between the center and the rest of the country. So either Russia sort of persists in being a kind of a self-immolating empire, going through a series of crises of various kinds, um, or Russia federalizes. Um, that is a constructive possibility, but it's not necessarily a likely possibility. Um, and then the third alternative is a kind of breakup. And more plausible than a neat disintegration may be sort of parts of the country peeling off at the edges. But even that would be a very calamitous and very uncontrollable scenario that would not lead to a flourishment of democratic life on that territory. But the fundamental truth remains that something doesn't add up as things stand. And it's going to be difficult for Russia's current imperial project to sustain itself. Uh, and the alternatives are roughly decentralization or some degree of peeling at the edges or some degree of disintegration. The trouble is that we don't know what shape things would take if the most constructive scenario arose and there was a process of decentralization without disintegration. And we've got to therefore say that we just don't know what's the best political formation for that, for folks on that territory. What's the best way for them to organize themselves politically? It has to be up to them. It's not up to us to break Russia up. It's not up to us to divide it into little bits. That's tempting for Ukrainians because Russia is their aggressive, sort of maniacally imperialist enemy. But in the end, we believe in self-determination. And of course, that applies to Russia too. So it's not up to us to tell them what shape they should take any more than it is for Russia to tell Ukrainians or tell us what shape we should take.
We don't have the power to do it in any
But
case.
nevertheless,
Yeah.
there's a structural problem there that I don't envisage constructive things happening in that space, politically or economically, without a very significant process of decentralization. And the more that decentralization process doesn't happen, the greater the risks are of more tumultuous and more catastrophic events occurring, perhaps short of a full disintegration on that territory.
I've always thought of it as a kind of tectonic plate or one of those sort of, areas that are prone to volcanoes. So if you have lots of little minor earthquakes, then you don't get the big one. But it seems that Russia builds up these huge tectonic forces because through creating external enemies, through aggression, through repression, you try to paper over all those cracks and kind of pretend they're not there rather than talking about them, dealing with them. I think it's useful potentially to enter a dialogue with Russians. And the irony here is that some in the so-called Russian liberal opposition berate Westerners for not engaging and not doing this and not doing that and not helping to aid their democracy. But from my own personal experience, as you know, I've reached out to all of them numerous times and got literal tumbleweed back. So on the one hand, you're not doing anything. You're not doing anything to help us. On the other hand, many of them don't clearly want any kind of help or assistance or even engagement in that kind of dialogue. I mean, there are exceptions. Kasparov, Khodorkovsky, if you can get him at the right moment, it seems to be fairly open. If you can catch him at the right moment, Panimarov, there are people who are engaging in these dialogues, but they're not at the heart of the opposition that is really talking about taking Putin on, taking back power. It seems fairly intractable. It seems to me.
I think that the Russian opposition is in a state of grave depoliticization, but in many ways, so are we. In many ways, so is a lot of public discourse in Ukraine. This is a global disease, again, of which the Russian opposition are just an extreme example. The biggest challenge for the Russian opposition is that you don't truly become post-imperial by letting the imperial ideas go. You become post-imperial by replacing them with something else. And what that something else is has to be not a theoretical proposal concocted in a cool room, but has to be a product of political engagement. And instead of that, what you often get are statements about how Russia should join the civilized world. Which have a degree of vagueness so great that they're really aesthetic or moral statements, they're not political statements. To a degree, Mr. Navalny was able to politicize Russian politics. His colleagues and his followers, in my analysis, are not doing that. And politicization means actually engaging with those bits of the Russian population that are not the small minority who happen to support Western liberal democratic values. So my question to the Russian opposition would be, how do you envisage the very institutions that have persecuted you in Russia? How do you envisage the FSB? What's your plan for the military? Do you have a 15-point manifesto for the shape of the Russian army by 2040? In other words, I want a real engagement, sort of a real proposal of alternatives that generates tension, that generates political friction in Russia and gets things moving, instead of a set of largely moralized addresses to people who already agree with these addresses. What I'll add to that, however, is that most of the conventional critiques we encounter in the pro-Ukrainian space of the Russian opposition are as depoliticized as the Russian opposition itself. A classic example, in my opinion, is the critique of Mr. Navalny for imperialism, when, for instance, he talked about Crimea not being a sandwich that can be passed back and forth. The reality is that nobody's asking us in the West, and nobody's asking Ukrainians, frankly, to support or love or vote for any member of Navalny's team. A political relation to somebody like Navalny and his team would be, are they an actor that helps our political purposes? If they are, we engage with it. If they're not, we ignore it or we challenge it. But the idea of making moral incantations about Mr. Navalny is just not a political idea. In fact, it's consumerist. It's relating to politics as though it's something that you encounter in a candy shop, and if the flavors aren't right, you don't take them. Well, no, questions like, are the activities of a certain group going to destabilize the Putin regime? Doesn't matter whether we like that group or not, or whether we agree with it. And anyway, nobody's asking us. I mean, I'm a British citizen. Nobody's ever going to ask me whether Mr. Navalny should be the UK Prime Minister. I don't have that kind of relationship. I don't need to love or like him. My questions are, is what he's doing and his organization used to do in the Russian space constructive or unconstructive? And if it's unconstructive, can I push them to make it constructive, or maybe I can somehow challenge the historical reality so that these folks are replaced with other more effective folks. That's politics.
Yes.
It's not politics just to moralize about them, because what we're doing when we do that is literally mirroring the depoliticized moralization of the Russian opposition itself. And we're going in a kind of kumbaya circle of self-congratulatory expressive pronouncements, which actually don't help anybody, don't change the reality on the ground. But it's a very, very entrenched problem for the
Hmm.
Russian opposition, I'm afraid. And at the moment, I would categorize them as broadcasters, as moralists, as commentators. Some of them commentators addressing a Russian audience, like Navalny's team. Others, like Mr. Kasparov, commentators addressing a Western audience, basically. None of them I would categorize as a politician. And that's a real difficulty. And it's not an accident that's the case, because some of the same processes of depoliticization are also affecting us in our domestic politics. So if we can learn nothing from the Russian opposition about how to change Russia today, and I still think we can learn some things from them, and we can learn from them also what not to be politically and how not to do politics ourselves in our democracies.
Absolutely, and I think it's unfair when and actually unhelpful when we look at people as monoliths. Navalny changed his views. Certainly, in his letters from prison, he went back, re-examined, and was pretty open in some places of where he changed that point of view and where his point of view was now different and what the sources were. So I think those are the important things, not to see people as monoliths, to say, okay, I don't like some of the stuff this person's doing, but is there some common ground? Is there some dialogue? And actually, if those people are willing to engage in a dialogue, I use Ben Shapiro as a good example. I mean, many things I find deeply unpleasant about many of his views. But he is clearly someone who has engaged in dialogue and engages in dialogue with people who disagree with him profoundly and debates those points of view, and in certain circumstances has visibly changed his point of view as a result of some of those dialogues and processes. I think that's a people need to get beyond their sort of monolithic tribal attitude to these things, and look for where there's that way in, that way to sort of generate dialogue, debate, because that's maybe the only way we're going to claw ourselves out of this deep, dark hole.
Yeah, political disagreement does not have to be deep moral disagreement. And even deep moral disagreement doesn't have to go to the core of our identity. Somebody who is our political opponent today could be our ally tomorrow. So it's important to return to a slightly healthier, more tolerant, and more detached way of engaging in political opposition constructively. Something that I must say, people on the pro-democracy team, on our team in the West, struggle with too, struggle with quite a bit. And you're not effective if all of your political relations are heavily moralized and are just forms of self-expression about who you are deep in the core of your identity. A lot of politics is eating a bit of shit. It's realizing that alliances are complex, that things change, and that above all, you don't get to choose who you share the table of politics with. We can close our eyes to who is around us at the table of politics, but we can't sort of choose to disappear them unless we secede or emigrate. So it's also time for a return to a more tolerant and a more constructive, which doesn't mean not robust, relationship with those political things which we disagree with and which we challenge. Which also, of course, means that losing in politics doesn't have to be catastrophic unless you've lost everything, unless you've lost your democracy. And even then, you could try to get it back. You've lost today, you might win tomorrow. On another policy or even on the very same policy. So losing politically doesn't mean that we have been erased in our identity. It doesn't mean that we have experienced some kind of cataclysmic moral deletion. It just means we competed and we lost, and we need to compete better and make sure the other side loses tomorrow.
That's it. And I think, where even if you're diametrically opposed with somebody else, if you both agree the rules under which that competition is going to take place, then you have a way forward. I mean, the challenge here, of course, is Trumpism is about erasing those rules while trying to gaslight you into
How
thinking
how do you
that,
yeah
yeah,
how do you relate
Farageism,
to
I would say, probably is also
In my
about
judgment, yes.
trampling on the rules.
In my
Yeah.
judgment, unfortunately, yes, even though he is much more sort of civil and articulate.
Mhm.
But this is one of the paradoxes we face, that we need to treat people who treat us as enemies as though they were our opponents and not our enemies most of the time. And that's very, very difficult to do emotionally because it's just brutally unfair. But the truth is that in politics, you've got to try to win. It's about power more than it is about justice or being seen. And that's to say that very often it will be the case that the most effective way of challenging politicians like Trump is to treat him, but especially his voters, not as enemies, but as opponents who join you in an enterprise of conflict within a framework of cooperation. And holding that is really difficult when the other side isn't doing that. However, it's probably 80% of the time the case that treating people who treat you as enemies as opponents is the most effective way of making them lose. Some of the time, you can challenge that framework and you can say you've got to treat them as enemies. But the reality is that we've got to focus on winning and not on outrage at the unbelievable ghastliness and misbehavior of the other side who are refusing to play the game properly. And so we're going to sit on the sideline and fold our hands and wait for them to start playing the game properly before we join in. Now we've got to compete strongly. And unfortunately, this means the very, very difficult job of actually treating people who treat you as enemies as though they were your opponents and not your enemies. That's how you're going to make their voters vote for you and not for them next time.
Vlad, we should end it there. I've been, Dara said, I've pushed my luck here, and we've got a whole hour recorded, which is fabulous and more than I could have ever have hoped for. And it's been a scintillating conversation as well, which I hope the audience get as much value from it as I have. I want to say a huge thank you for coming back on, and greatly missed by my audience, and I think they'll be delighted to see you back doing again such a long and immersive episode.
Thank you so much for having me and see you soon again.
Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to make a personal recommendation that I know you will appreciate. You may have seen my interview last week with the producer of the film series Kyiv of Mine, Ronnie Apteker. Well, I've partnered with them to help raise awareness of what I believe is an important series of films made for a Western audience to help break through absurd stereotypes about Ukraine, some of which, of course, are amplified by Russian propaganda. You can watch these films for free now. Details in a second. Kyiv of Mine is a documentary series about Ukraine's extraordinary capital, which I had the privilege to visit for the first time in January this year. The film production began in 2018, and of course, much has changed since then. It's now 2025, and the story is far from over. Kyiv of Mine is a fast-paced, beautifully filmed, humorous, fun, insightful, heartbreaking, moving, and hopeful work. The very antithesis, in fact, of a doom-laden and worthy wartime documentary. This is a work that is extraordinarily uplifting. My friend Operator Starsky says the film is made with so much love. The film series will make you laugh and cry. It's the only film about Ukraine that began before the war yet has traced lives through the tumultuous times, and which follows the lives of more than a dozen Ukrainians in real time. This is an historic period told through highly personal and emotive stories from Kyiv's days of emerging prosperity after the Maidan Revolution through COVID and the full-scale invasion. This film is a breath of fresh air. Ukraine deserves a better conversation in the world, one that isn't centered around war, says Jolyon Ellis, filmmaker on Kyiv of Mine. It's hard not to argue with that, and the filmmakers have fully delivered on this promise. This is essential watching for anyone who calls themselves pro-Ukrainian, but I think it's also vital to get friends, colleagues, and family to watch it too, because the reality is few people have a vivid impression of Ukraine or any direct connection with its people. War is inhumane and abstract,
building an alternative perception is essential for engaging the world with the importance of Ukraine's struggle. A final word from our partners, the makers of Kyiv of Mine. All three films are now available to watch for free on YouTube. Please check out the links to the dedicated website, which tells you more about the film, its subjects, and the filmmakers. Also in the description is a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the films now. Do let us know in the comments what you think of them and if they inspire you as much as they have inspired me.